Do you remember the early 90s? It was the time when the world was reordered after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. And people started to look forward to a new millennium. But it was also the time something new emerged, the internet. At the beginning, nobody really knew what to do about it, and there was only a few technology enthusiasts and computer geeks that could use it and could make sense of things like TCP/IP, SMTP, URLs, etc. But nobody had a clue how much of a groundbreaking technology this internet was, and how much it was going to influence our lives over the next 20 years, since nobody heard of things like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Skype. Now, fast forward to fall 2008, and we are in the midst of the biggest financial crisis of a century. The years between the birth of the internet in the early 90s and the financial crisis of 2008 were also the years where global banks saw unprecedented and, in hindsight, unhealthy growth. I'm sure you remember the biggest bankruptcy case of those days, Lehman Brothers in fall 2008. Governments had then to come to rescue a lot of banks and bail them out. And this shattering meltdown of the financial system caused many people to lose trust into the then established centralized world order. They also started to question governments, since they didn't understand why banks had to be bailed out by taxpayers' money in the first place. I remember vividly coming to work every day during these dark days, having witnessed endless cycles of redundancies around me. And it was upsetting to see how whole teams, including my own, were dismantled. Now, I'm sure you're wondering how my topic today, the blockchain, fits in with all of this. Well, today we are at the time again, like in the early 90s, when a new technology, this time the blockchain, emerged. And to link my trip down memory lane about the financial crisis to this topic, this technology was born just 2 months after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. In that fall, somebody called Satoshi Nakamoto released a white paper onto the internet entitled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And the first sentence in that white paper reads, a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. Was this just a coincidence, or very well timed that somebody released such an idea at a time when trust into the centralized system was lost? We will probably never know, as the author of the white paper and therefore the father of the blockchain remains anonymous to the day. But be it as it is, the blockchain was born with the release of that groundbreaking paper and is described by many as the biggest technological invention since the internet. I'm sure you're wondering how the blockchain now really works. Well, there's a couple of people that describe it as follows. Blockchain technology facilitates peer-to-peer transactions without any intermediary such as a bank or a governing body. Don Tapscott, who I cited here, is one of the world's leading innovators and thought leader on the topic of blockchain. So at its core, the blockchain makes it possible to remove all middlemen when transacting with digital assets, as they will simply not be needed anymore. But wait a minute, the white paper had the topic Bitcoin, not blockchain. Why is that? Well, I would like to use a simple example. Imagine that the Bitcoin is a simple application that leverages the blockchain technology to send money around. The same way, like an email application leverages the internet to send an email around. And so here we come and start demystifying this blockchain. At its core, the blockchain is nothing else but a database. A database that is public, therefore not owned by anybody, distributed, therefore not stored centrally on a computer, but on many computers across the world, constantly synchronized to keep the transactions up to date, and secured overall by the art of cryptography to make it tamper-proof and hacker-proof. These 4 features make this technology exceptional. And I believe this can lead to great things. In fact, I just made one of the biggest decisions in my life last month, and I gave up a 20-year career in financial services to fully focus on this topic. This newly found passion of mine started exactly a year ago while visiting Silicon Valley. There, a lot of people talked about blockchain, and after reading a few books and talking to more people, I was hooked and decided to be part of that blockchain ecosystem here in Switzerland. Thank God I'm not alone in this discovery journey of the blockchain. There are quite a few other people involved in this topic, and especially a lot of investors have recently joined the party. Overall, there was more than $1 billion invested in Bitcoin and blockchain technologies in the last years. More than half of that alone last year. But now let's make this more real and I'll show you a few examples of how this works. First, for Bitcoins, there are many services available already. Some of you might have heard of wallet services. One example of such a wallet service is Xapo. Xapo has a wallet that you basically download onto your iPhone or on your computer, and then ultimately can sell, buy, spend your Bitcoins at retailers and so forth. And they incidentally opened an office here in Switzerland just last year and store some of their service in a big bunker in the Swiss mountains. Then there are other examples in the financial services industry. For instance, dealing with equities, bonds, and derivatives. One such example is Nasdaq, who launched a service, a blockchain-based marketplace service together with a startup called Chain, and to trade non-public shares just last October. But let's move away from financial services examples to something that is more interesting, other industries. I show you some examples here that are a little bit early stage, but they're all real nonetheless. First, OpenBazaar. OpenBazaar allows you to open your own marketplace, your own shop on the blockchain, and then ultimately trade peer-to-peer with your clients, removing the need for e-commerce middlemen like eBay and the likes. Another example is Lassus. With Lassus, you basically they take on Uber and Lyft and the likes, and they connect driver spare capacity with riders directly. Next, for those who like the music, Ucho Music. With Ucho Music, the artists and their work connect directly, ultimately, with the clients, removing the need for the likes of Apple Music, Spotify, and make a much fairer deal for the artists themselves. And lastly, OneName. With OneName, you can open your own blockchain ID, which is then used for you to sign into services like Twitter, Skype, Facebook, and the likes. So gone are the days where you had to have a password for all these sites. You can use the blockchain ID going forward for all of this. And personally, I think such blockchain services have a bright future, since you can not only store passwords, but any other personal information securely on the blockchain. But in order for this to work, governments would need to start formally accepting such blockchain IDs and start issuing their official documents digitally to you rather than physically. So passports, driver's licenses, birth and marriage certificates, and so forth. But then, public notaries could link the land registers that are based on the blockchain, something some countries are already doing, directly to you via the blockchain ID, so very efficiently and safe. Voting could take place on the blockchain as well. So the next presidential or any other election can take place comfortably from the comfort of your living room. Doctors could upload their health records to the blockchain and link your personal files directly to your ID. So when you travel and have an accident abroad, you would always have your medical details with you. Such services take time to develop, clearly, but it's also not just science fiction. Just last month, the UK government released a big report on blockchain, recommending the UK government to deeply investigate this technology and see how it can be used for governmental services. And Estonia launched e-residency last year, a campaign that looks at government-issued digital identities. As part of that campaign, Estonia has now teamed up with BitNation, a startup in Estonia, to offer public notary services, and since December, Estonian marriages can be directly linked to the blockchain via such services. But now I have to, unfortunately, warn you a little bit again. We are not quite there yet where all of this becomes reality for all of us to use. While Bitcoin was there for 7 years and has been testing the blockchain technology extensively, Bitcoin had anything but a quiet ride since its inception, which makes a lot of people skeptical, and probably rightly so. And then there are some regulatory questions that still need to be addressed. Again, for Bitcoin, the fact that they removed the need for banks in the middle, and that includes central banks, make a few governments a bit nervous. So while we have technological and regulatory issues to be resolved, I have no doubt that this will be the case and will be done soon. And that's one of the reasons why I founded my company, to be part of that next evolution of the blockchain technology. So I wonder if the financial crisis was a good thing and was an opportunity after all for all of us. It might have inspired this brilliant mind to come up with this blockchain technology at a time when trust into the centralized system was lost. And even if it was a coincidence, it was definitely at the right time in history. I wonder if you look back in 20 years the same way we look back today at the early 90s and wonder how the blockchain technology has changed all our lives in such a dramatic fashion. With that, I would like to welcome you back in 2035 for a review of today's predictions. Thank you.
I'm going to start with a technology confession. The history of the web has been spectacular across all aspects, but it has been vexing in one thing that was missing from it. Being digital in the world of the web was missing something that was very native to it, in the same way that websites are very native to the web. Up until now, if you think about it, the web consisted mostly of moving information around. Being digital has been fundamental to many different areas, from e-commerce to publishing, travel services, supply chain, e-services. It has touched every single industry that you can think of. However, there's one thing that the web has not touched yet in a very fundamental way. And that thing is money. So now you may be thinking, well, what are you talking about, William? We can move money today on the web. Yes, you are right. But up until now, the banks were really in the middle of all of these transactions. And they led us to believe that we were interacting with each other. Yes, they fooled us. Whereas they were facilitating these interactions on our behalf. And as long as they controlled everything, they led us to believe that we needed their trust in order to store our money or to move our money. And that was true up until 4 years ago, when a new word started to enter our vocabulary, a new form of money, digital money, came along, Bitcoin, which I'm sure you've heard of. But even more important than Bitcoin and more fundamental to our future is the technology behind Bitcoin, and that is the blockchain. You may have heard about the blockchain. It may be a new word. Maybe it's obscure. But it's going to remain in our vocabulary, in the same way as the web and the internet have entered our vocabulary and have been in it for the last 20 years. What is the blockchain? The blockchain is this invisible network that is an overlay on top of the web. Think of it as doing the same thing that banks were doing to our money. Banks were needed to move our money. The blockchains are going to be needed to move this new form of money, the cryptocurrency. So the blockchains are this linkage between cryptocurrency. But the main difference is that blockchains are not owned by one entity or by one person. They are collectively shared, collectively operated, and collectively owned by thousands and thousands of computers around the world. So unlike banks, there's no bricks and mortar. They can scale and they can grow with no borders and without any regulation. And that, by the way, is a feature, not a bug. So remember the word blockchain. Money was the first application of the blockchain. And the reason why I said that it had not been touched fundamentally is because the banks were really between us and the internet. Whereas cryptocurrency, what the blockchain enables, is now enabling peer-to-peer transactions. That is really at the core of the internet. And if this was the first application, what do you think the next application is beyond money? Work. So let me ask you, how many of you, and please raise your hands, have one job? A job. So keep your hands. How many of you have two jobs? How many of you have three jobs? Okay. A lot of hands went down. Let me be honest with you. I think most of you that did not keep your hands up, I think you were lying to yourselves a little bit. Because in reality, we all have three jobs. The first job is the job that you go to the office for, or to the factory, or to a store. You get paid at the end of the week or at the end of the month. The second job is the job you have for taking care of yourself, taking care of your kids, your siblings, your house, cleaning, doing the dishes. The third job is the job that was outsourced, not to somebody in the Philippines or in India or in Poland. It was outsourced to you by a friendly company that you do business with on a daily basis, perhaps. They outsourced the job that used to be performed by one of their employees, and now you're doing it. Think about booking a travel online, or booking a hotel online, or any type of self-service task that you are now doing thanks to the web. But the difference is that we had not been paid for this kind of job in the past. And this is about to change. Work as we know it is going to be married to the blockchain in more ways than one. And we can divide work in two different types. There's active work and passive work. Active work is the work that you are very conscious about. You know that you are doing something. You are driving a car, or you are writing a software program. You are conscious of what you're doing. The more fascinating type of work is passive work. It is fascinating because you are doing it without being aware of you doing it, and more importantly, it is generating value without you knowing that it is generating value. And the new thing with the blockchain is that somebody, some company, is going to be willing to pay you for the value that you are generating by doing passive work, because that is valuable to them. In the same way as governments issue currency, and every government, every country has their own currency, in the near future, and this is happening right now, companies will be issuing their own currency, which we will call cryptocurrency, or crypto for short. And they will be issuing that currency to us. And this will be a currency that is liquid. It is not the same as receiving points or getting a store credit. It is something that you can buy and sell with. You can earn something and you can spend it at the same time. Let me give you some examples. Attention. Attention is a currency. Think about Facebook. The average person spends about an hour per day on Facebook. Doing what? We give them our attention. They take our attention. They take the eyeballs that we have, the time we've spent, and they repackage it and sell it as advertising. And what do they give us? Nothing in return. If Facebook was reinvented in the day of the blockchain in a decentralized manner, they would be compensating us because we are the ones that are helping them to resell the advertising that they are making billions of dollars for. Attention is a currency. and we own it, and we will be able to benefit from it in the future. With the blockchain, there are decentralized content networks now that will pay you if you spend time with them. Another example, data. We are data-emitting devices constantly. Everywhere we go, everything we do, everything about us, our height, weight, demographics, age, what we are doing, this is all valuable data. What if we could provide that data to another entity that could take the data, aggregate it, and give us something back in return that is more valuable to us? But for them, it was valuable to receive our data. What if they gave us some value, a token for our data, a token in the form of a cryptocurrency, which we can then reuse to buy something else? I'm sure that many of you, maybe not all, would gladly say, if that was the case, please take my data. Another area is something we own, and maybe we can share. And I'm not thinking of Airbnb. Think about your own computers, which are sitting there for most of the time doing nothing. What if we could share a little tiny piece of your disk drive, or a tiny piece of your processing power that you're not using, and you can get paid for it? And then one day you want more, maybe you can use that currency to buy something yourself. These are examples that are happening right now. So what is going on right now, we're moving from user-generated content, which you are familiar with, which is really the cornerstone of social media. When you post a picture on Instagram, or when you write a few lines on Facebook or on a blog, that is called user-generated content. In the future, we're going to have user-generated work. But this is work which we are going to get paid for by the blockchain, by all of these cryptocurrencies that will come into existence. These are some examples of some of those tokens or cryptocurrency tokens. Golem is for buying and selling cloud computing. Another one called StoreJ for cloud storage. Saya for file transfer. Steemit for content publishing. You publish something, you get voted up, you earn some Steam dollars. And you can trade them for real dollars. And there will be a plethora of these types of work-related cryptocurrencies that will be issued by these companies. And we are going to be the recipient of these currencies. Now, let's think about this. What's going on here? We have three big themes that have converged at the same time. We have a new system of money, digital money, cryptocurrency, which is the internet of money, money on wings that can travel very fast, nobody in the middle. We have a new system of work where we do passive work, we generate value, and we get paid for it. And we have a new system of technology, the blockchain, which is very decentralized, peer-to-peer, like the web. It's everywhere and nowhere. What's the end result? The end result is that we're going to have a lot of services that are going to become decentralized, that are going to not be centralized. Facebook is centralized. So let's imagine. Imagine banking without banks that maybe we don't trust, or maybe are not fast enough for us, or too expensive to do business with. Imagine e-commerce without eBay, without credit card fees, without listing fees. Imagine gambling without a house. Maybe we don't trust the house. Imagine transportation without Uber, where every driver is a node of their own, and we can deal with them directly. Imagine stock trading without the NASDAQ or stock exchanges, where we can interact and peer-to-peer trade with each other. This is happening right now in a small scale, but that is how the web started as well, more than 20 years ago. And we are going to be moving from a web economy to a blockchain economy. Today, the blockchain economy overall is probably about $40 billion. When you add the value of all of the cryptocurrencies that exist today, in addition to the companies that are part of this phenomenon. But in the future, it is going to get bigger and bigger slowly. Everything starts small until it is big. The end game is going to be a combination of currency tokens and work-related tokens, and we'll be able to trade them. And we'll be able to spend and earn at the same time. And that is why this is now going to be a new economy of its own. So how do you get involved? How do you benefit and how do you participate in this? You have to be curious and try to go and find out where you can get involved and earn tokens or earn currency for some of the work that you could be doing, or maybe you have something that others want, and you could be sharing it and receiving tokens in return. This is the future. So the blockchain has not just given us a new form of money, it has given us a new form of earning money as well and spending it. And you might think, well, what's wrong with the system that we have today? Why are we not happy with what we have? This is not something about changing what we have today. We cannot change the current system. There comes a point in the technology evolution where there is a paradigm shift, and you cannot change anything anymore. You have to go to a new system. The cellular phones, when they came along, they did not use the landlines. They put new towers everywhere. There was a new infrastructure. When the web came along, the web did not use the old mainframes, the computer mainframes. It was a new network out there. The same thing is happening with the blockchain and the currencies behind it. This is a new form of money. It's a new form of network where the trust is with the network, not with the banks, not with the credit card companies, not with the financial intermediaries. And that is really the future of the blockchain. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. Remember that the money in your pocket and the money in your bank account is going to get some competition. Competition is going to come from cryptocurrency in your smartphone wallets and inside of the applications in your smartphones that you will be using on a daily basis, where you earn and you spend cryptocurrency. This is the future, and I hope you are as excited as I am about it. It's going to touch you, and I hope it's going to inspire you at the same time. Welcome to the blockchain economy.
It's been over 8 years since Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. But the financial crisis still continues to cast a long shadow over all of our lives. What began as an economic calamity has morphed into something that's more corrosive and arguably more dangerous, a crisis of legitimacy, not just in banks, but in many of our institutions, including governments. We're feeling now that globalization, capitalism, even democracy are in retreat, while populism, nativism, protectionism are on the rise. And really, who's to blame the people who support these kinds of ideologies? Europe has lost an entire generation to economic stagnation. Social and economic inequality is at the highest level it's been since the Great Depression. In October, this month, Spain's youth unemployment rate is at 45%, 8 years after the crisis. Now, there's no silver bullet to fix the many problems that ail society. But why not start with where it all began? We have an opportunity, arguably once-in-a-generation opportunity, to reinvent financial services for a new era of trust and legitimacy. Now, the leaders of the industry today, many of the banks and others, have a choice to make. They can either do it themselves or have it done to them. Because We are entering a new era of technology. You've heard the expression, software is eating the world. Well, software is finally eating Wall Street. And the technology likely to have the greatest impact on the world of financial services for the next 20 years has arrived. But it's not big data, the cloud, robo-advisors, collaborative finance, or new entrants like Tencent and Apple Pay. It's actually the technology behind cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and it's called the blockchain. This technology will transform the industry, but it also represents nothing short of the second generation of the internet. So when you use the internet today to send and move and share information, you're not actually sending an original, you're sending a copy, and you're retaining an original. And generally speaking, that's okay. In fact, it's one of the great advantages of the internet is that we have this publishing platform that allows us to democratize information. Except when it comes to things that have value, like, say, money, sending a copy is a bad idea. If I give you $20 in payment for something, it's really important that you know you have it and I don't still have it. Because if I could send the same $20 to every single person in this room, the $20 becomes worthless. So it turns out it's great to have a printing press for information, but it's not so great to have a printing press for money. And this is a problem that cryptographers and technologists have been trying to resolve for years. How do you prevent this digital trail of breadcrumbs from accumulating every time you move information? Turns out it's difficult. And as a result, we rely on middlemen, intermediaries, to perform a whole bunch of important roles in business and society. And these intermediaries would be well known to many of you, banks, but also governments and big technology firms. And these intermediaries perform essential roles. They establish the identity of parties in a transaction. They create trust. They perform what's called the business logic, the clearing and the settling, and they keep records that can be validated by the counterparties in the transaction, by auditors, regulators, and other stakeholders. And they do an okay job, but they have some very serious limitations. The first is that they're all centralized. Anything centralized is vulnerable to hacking or to attack or to failure. This happens in the financial service industry as well as other industries. They slow things down. The settlement times for all sorts of transactions can last into the days or the weeks. To send money overseas from one country to another can take 5 to 7 days. They're also costly. To make that same transaction can sometimes cost 8 to 10%. Another big issue is that they exclude big parts of the population. There are 2.5 billion people in the world who don't have access to any form of financial services. They're part of the world's unbanked who don't really benefit at all from globalization and internationalism because they're trapped and they're not upwardly mobile. They capture data about us, which prevents us from using it to organize our affairs, but also could potentially undermine our privacy. So you can argue in some that intermediaries capture an asymmetric benefit from the digital age, and banks are certainly no exception. So what if the internet was entering a second era, from an internet of information to an internet of value? Well, right around the same time that Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, November of 2008, an anonymous person or group of persons named Satoshi Nakamoto outlined a new thing called the Bitcoin protocol, a way for people to do transactions and move money peer-to-peer online without an intermediary to establish trust. And the interesting thing about Bitcoin was that it worked. And it worked so well that it set off a spark that's traveled like wildfire and captured the imagination of people in many different industries, not just in financial services, but in music, in film, in supply chain management, and other areas. Underpinning Bitcoin is this revolutionary technology called the blockchain, a vast global distributed database, a single source of truth that doesn't run on one computer, it runs on all computers. And it's not accessible to a few, but it's accessible to all. Where not just information, but potentially anything of value, Bitcoin, to be sure, but also money, financial assets, intellectual property, carbon credits, energy, even votes in an election can be moved, stored, and managed securely and privately, and where trust is not established by a third party, but rather through mass collaboration, cryptography, and clever code. And it turns out that Bitcoin is just the start. Ethereum is a relatively new blockchain platform that's pioneered a technology called smart contracts, which is basically what it sounds like, software that mimics the logic of a contract, with guaranteed execution, enforcement, and payments, without relying on banks, escrow agents, lawyers, courts, and the other intermediaries that add friction and cost to contracting. If you think about what impact this could have in financial services, it's nothing short of profound. Every single asset, basically, is a contract. It's a piece of paper that gives you a promissory note entitling you to something, a dividend payment, a coupon, equity in a company, etc. The Linux Foundation, no stranger to massive open source projects, has also gotten on board, launching the Hyperledger project, which now counts amongst its members thousands of technologists and hundreds of companies. So this technology has the ability to create a more prosperous world. And in our book, Blockchain Revolution, we outline how that might work. And the opportunities here are significant. Everything from enabling creators of content, like musicians and journalists and filmmakers, to get fairly compensated for the value that they create, to improving on the land titling that exists in the developing world. 70% of people in the developing world who think they own property actually have a very flaky title to that property. What that means is that when push comes to shove, there might be a duplicate claim, there might be a missing record, or there might be a lack of enforcement that prevents them from using that as a source of income, as a way to access credit, to pay for education, to start a business. So there are some very interesting applications. I'd like to discuss financial services, though, with you today. So the financial services industry can be a complicated thing to understand. It is one of the world's most important industries. It is the linchpin of our modern economic system. Its leaders are known as masters of the universe. But when you really drill down, it actually performs 8 essential functions in business and society. Everything from enabling people to get access to a mortgage, to allowing businesses and individuals to move money around the world, to insuring against catastrophic risk, to enabling companies to access growth capital to start their business. Something familiar to all of you, I'm sure. What about accounting? Silence. Who gives a TED Talk on accounting, honestly? It's like, bring out the guy who talks about flying cars. But there's a real opportunity here to fix accounting, because accounting's basically broken, and there are 4 big problems with it. The first one is that it assumes that managers will always do the right thing. Big mistake. Enron, Tyco, Toshiba, WorldCom, the financial crisis. This is a dangerous assumption to have when you're starting out. The second issue is human error. 35% of accounting fraud is actually due to some unintentional mistake. You know, poor Pam in the back office fat fingers an entry into an Excel spreadsheet, and like a butterfly flapping its wings, it reverberates across the whole enterprise and creates a big crisis. New rules like Sarbanes-Oxley, which came into effect after Enron, have done little to curb wrongdoing. And the big issue is that modern accounting practices can't really keep up with the velocity and the complexity of companies and businesses. And deciphering a financial statement is kind of like watching 2 people dancing under a strobe light. You see bits and pieces, an arm, a head, you know, someone shaking their booty, but you don't actually get the whole picture. Because accounting is based on a principle that's actually quite ancient. It's a 500-year-old thing. It's called double entry bookkeeping, where for every transaction you record a debit and a credit, and in the end, your balance sheet balances. And it worked well in the Middle Ages, and it's worked well throughout most of modern capitalism, but there's a way to improve it significantly. So imagine every time you entered into a transaction, you didn't just record a debit or a credit, but there was a time-stamped receipt of that transaction, which went to a distributed ledger that everyone could trust was verifiable, that they could search, that they could manipulate in a way that they could gain a clear picture of the financial health of a company. Financial statements would go from this thing we do with the cycles of the moon every quarter, where we get this sort of 2D facsimile of what's actually happening in a company, to something that's living and breathing and true. How about funding and investing? You know, that's something that I think a lot of people here know about, venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, et cetera. It's an industry that's dominated by, investors like VCs, investment banks, and others. And there's an opportunity here to completely change that paradigm. So a funny thing happened a few months ago, actually the week we launched the book, which is that this thing called the Distributed Autonomous Organization came into existence. And it was a company like no other. It had no managers, for starters. It had no assets. It had no home office. Actually, it didn't even have people. It was just a collection of smart contracts. And it was designed as a venture fund of sorts to make investments in the industry. And by the way, those of you who are in the VC industry here today, who are accustomed to 2 and 20, you're not going to like the fee structure on some of these new companies. 0 and 0. Half the room got that, half the room didn't. So the fascinating thing about this company, more interesting than everything I just explained, was that in 6 weeks, it raised $165 million from tens of thousands of investors all around the world. So what does it mean when you're an entrepreneur and the cost of doing business can drop significantly, not least of which is the cost of capital, of raising money? But it turns out that we could be at the halcyon days of entrepreneurship here, where little companies could have all the capabilities of big companies without the legacy issues, like bureaucracy and culture. The mood in Silicon Valley belies a more troubling statistic, which is that entrepreneurship and innovation, well, not innovation, entrepreneurship is actually declining. In the 1980s, 9% of people under the age of 30 had equity in a private company. Today, it's 3%. So this could help to jumpstart entrepreneurship in a meaningful way. And since barriers are lowering in industries, there's an opportunity for people, anybody, to challenge the banks in all of their core areas. The thing about financial crises is they can breed political crises, crises of legitimacy. And I think we're facing that right now. People question whether or not politicians are actually acting in their best interest. And it's led to the rise of populists all over the developed world. Now, populism is seductive, but it rarely works. After the Brexit vote, the leading Brexiteers all scurried from view like rats from a sinking ship, and the political establishment was tossed into this caustic battle for control. And oddly enough, one person emerged to provide leadership, and it was the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who in the weeks leading up to the referendum vote and in the weeks after made speeches and introduced papers from the Bank of England that basically argued for a radical rethinking of how economies ought to function, starting with financial services. And he focused on two things in particular: fintech, which is the umbrella term to describe how technology is impacting finance, and blockchain. And one of the most radical proposals that he made, and the bank has continued to make, is the idea of introducing a digital currency to replace the existing fiat currencies that countries and intergovernmental organizations like the EU issue and control. Call it a Britcoin. That's my dad joke for the day. All right. The advantages of doing this are actually quite obvious. We have a financial messaging system. You go to Starbucks, you tap your card on the card reader, and you feel like there's a transaction happening peer-to-peer from you to the merchant. Or you buy a share and you see it show up in your brokerage account. But it's not actually a way to do transactions digitally. It's just a way to message that a transaction has happened. So if you had a native digital medium for money, you could actually transform a lot of things. And you could create a lot of benefits. The first one is speed, cost, and efficiency. If transactions settled in a native digital bearer instrument, like a Britcoin, then you wouldn't need third parties to perform all of these important clearing and settlement functions. That would drop the settlement time from anywhere from 2 days in public equities to 25 days in trade finance and interbank lending to 0 days, actually 0 seconds, and would take the cost from whatever it is in those markets to next to nothing. The second thing is performance and inclusion. If you have a new platform to build all sorts of new capability in financial services, you can do a lot more, like target the 2.5 billion people in the world who don't have access to a bank account. The basics of retail banking, again, simplifying this industry, are payments and savings, and then credit. But basically payments and savings. If you can give people a way to store value that's not tied up in a piece of land with a flaky title or in an animal that might keel over and die, and a way to make payments, say send a remittance home from their family in San Francisco to somewhere in Latin America, you solve 90% of their financial problems. We have an opportunity here to make the industry do more for more people. And then the final thing is improving transparency and reducing risk. If transactions settle instantly, then you don't have to worry about settlement risk. If it takes no time for value to reach another person, you don't have to worry about counterparty risk, the risk that the person on the other end might not have the funds to settle the trade. And in aggregate, all of these risks together reduces systemic risk, the risk that too much risk gets concentrated in one part of the system, and that can create problems overall. But ultimately, improving transparency will improve accountability and hold those in power accountable for their actions. So, to paraphrase the Beatles, all you need is trust. But what is trust? Trust is the expectation that the other party will abide by their commitments, that they will act with integrity. And it's been very difficult